So the VBA challenge is not necessarily the most difficult challenge when it comes to VBA, but it is very practical and very applicable to your kind of line of business. And if you follow along, I think there's a lot of things to learn from this. The diversity of the actual challenge will actually come to the fore as we go through this, and therefore I think it's definitely worth your while. So the instructions basically say asks you to write a sub, a function, or a macro to format any selection of data. And the test data can be found in the raw export sheet. So the test data is essentially something that you can use to test your stuff with. Remember to make a copy of the raw export sheet before running any macro on it. Remember that VBA macros cannot be undone. So you can't go and go Control Z after running VBA macro. It doesn't work. So if you make changes to the sheet, the changes will be there. The only way to revert back is to go back on the previous version, or to not save and go back, and hopefully it didn't save. Right, so basically I'm just going to create a copy of this this raw export sheet, and essentially I'm just going to call this backup so that we have a little backup sheet, and then basically I'm going to run through the instructions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little screenshot of this and just keep this on the side. And if you're looking for an excellent screenshot tool, I've got a tool called Screenpresso, like espresso, but Screenpresso, and it works really, really well. So I can highly recommend it. Basically, I'm going to keep the instructions on the side. You can keep the instructions on the side as well, and we're going to see how Excel actually creates the macro as we're running it. So I'm going to the raw export sheet, and I'm going to press Alt and F11 together, and Alt F11 actually opens up the VBA window. You'll see it says Microsoft Visual Basic for Applications, and the only reason I'm opening this up is so that I can show you how Excel is creating writing the code while we are doing this. And I don't typically necessarily use macros to start with, but it's a nice way to get to know how to create macros and how to write these things. So it's the best way to learn, is to see how Excel does it, and then just sort of tweak the code afterwards, so that it runs properly and that you sort of remove all the extras that's not necessary. So you'll see that the VBA window actually has your projects. It's got everything that you have open at this stage listed here, and you can see all the objects, you can see all sheets, and you can see workbook, and you can also see modules as soon as you start writing it. So you get a module, you get a class, etc., and we'll unpack these in a lot of detail as we're going through this. But you can have a user form, which is essentially a little graphical user interface, or a form that you can design so that the user can interact with your macros or your program. The module is essentially a sort of piece of code or a module of code that you can save, and the class module something a bit more complex, but we'll cover that in the later sessions. All right, so as soon as we start recording a macro, you'll see that Excel actually builds a little module over here, and because I've got the developer tab activated, let me show you just how to activate the developer tab. You go File Options, and then you go Customize Ribbon, and you make sure that your developer tab is ticked over here. And as soon as you've got that ticked, you'll also have visibility. Maybe you already have visibility without the developer tab, but that gives you the ability to start recording a macro. Alright, so I'm just going to arrange my windows so that I can see both windows and I can basically interact with this. I am going to just pull it like that, and just before I do that, let's just start recording the macro. We're going to call this format test. You can call it anything you want. No spaces in that name. You can also define a scope, so you can say I want to write it in this workbook or your personal macro workbook. Your personal macro workbook always opens up when Excel is open. So if you have code that you want to use across many workbooks, you can put that in the personal macro workbook, or you can put it in a new workbook, and you can even assign a keyboard shortcut to it. So if you want to do this or use it regularly, you can actually assign a little keyboard shortcut to this. Let's just go G, for instance, Control Shift G, and that gives me the ability to create a little shortcut like that. Click on OK. It's not necessary to create a shortcut, right? You'll see that the module was created here, and you can see that's module 1. So I can go into the module, and you can see it's already defined a sub, and it's called its format test, and there's no sort of parameters that are being passed, and that's the end of the sub. And then it's also telling me that that's the keyboard shortcut. So if I do anything on the sheet now, it will be written on this side. So the first instruction is bold the header row. So I'm going to select the header row, and I'm going to bold it. And you can see that's exactly what it's done there. Selected row 1, and it's taken the selection and it's made the font bold, true. Okay. So add an auto filter on the selection. So I'm going to go and just click outside of this and go Control Shift L, and that creates an auto filter. And what I can do is I can also put spaces in between this, so that I know that that's sort of step number 2. And then the next instruction is removing any columns without headers. That's not something that we can necessarily do with a macro. That's where we need to actually start programming, and that's where VBA comes in, right? But what I can do is I can ask Excel to tell me how to delete a column, because I want to delete a column without a header. And the first column is an example, because there's no header in column A. It's empty there. So I'm just going to select column A, and I'm going to right click and go delete, and I can see that that's step number 3. So columns A was selected, and the selection was deleted. Okay, cool. And then the next one is removing empty columns containing no data except for a header row. So that would be a column like this, and how I can test that is I can go Control down, and that goes all the way down to the bottom of Excel. And if I go all the way up, I can see that this is definitely an empty column, and so it has a header, but there's no information in it, and the instructions are saying delete that as well. Okay, so I know that I didn't need this that was written there, so I can actually go and remove that while we're creating the macro, so that I can keep the macro as clean as possible. I mean, even if I do some scrolling, you can see that scrolling is actually writing or creating a little code here as well. And then I can remove this if I don't want this repeated in the future, right? You can see there's a lot of scrolling coming through, so I'm going to remove that. Okay, then next up we want to replace all null data with blanks. So any nulls must be replaced with blanks. So I'm going to go Control H, and that opens up the find and replace, but it opens it up on replace. And I'm going to say anything that's null, replace that with nothing. Do that within the sheet. I'm going to replace all. Okay, and that's done that, right? It's done. It's made 13,000 replacements, and there's the code for this. Right, so I didn't need to select this, so again I can remove this sort of plot. And I'm not expecting you to know what to remove and when, but as it comes with experience, and we'll go through this in a bit more detail. Next up, we want to format all dates as dates that Excel recognizes as dates. And basically this date, if I take this date for instance, this is not a proper date. And if I actually change the formatting of this, just see, if I change the formatting of this to, it's already formatted as general, and I can see it's not a number. If I format this as a long date, it's not changing the formatting. So this is text, this is strings, and I want to convert this into dates. So that's what we want to do with this. So I'm going to I'm going to just remove these 3 rows because we don't want to keep them. But basically what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select this, and I'm going to use a little trick, a little hack, and that's using text to columns. I'm going to go to data, and I'm going to go to text to columns, and it doesn't matter what you select here. I'm going to essentially go next. I can leave this ticked, or I can untick this. I'm just going to untick this, and you'll see why. And then I'm going to say this is a date, and firstly we are expecting the day, then the month, then the year, and then Excel goes and it actually converts this to proper dates, and you'll see that this is now actually going to be a long date. Okay, we don't mind that, but let's just leave that. But essentially this is what we wanted to do. We wanted to do this text to columns, and essentially this array 1-4 is what's making it a date. The rest of this information is sort of not necessary, but Excel is writing all of the information, or all of the parameters that can be part of calling text to columns, writing it out for us, so we can just use it as is because it's working, right? Then the next step is to format the header row to replace any spaces with underscores and make all headers lowercase. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to select row 1. I'm going to go Control H, and I'm going to say anything that has a space needs to become an underscore, and I'm going to replace all. Okay, and that's the sort of last step. And then we also want to make it lowercase. So in order to remember to make it lowercase, I would want to just put a little note here, and I can put a single quote and then say remember to make the header row lowercase, because we're just going to use a function for that, a built-in function. And that's it, right? So we've created the macro. We've done all 7 steps, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But we need to do some tweaking now in order for this to work on any data set, right? So I'm going to just stop the macro, and that writes the macro out for me. And what I can also do now is I can go and just see. So that's my raw export. Then I can go and I can just copy these things across into my window. And it's always good when you're writing these macros, make sure that you actually include comments or notes in what you're writing, right? So if you want to have this comment and uncomment block, you can essentially go and I think you go to View and you go to Toolbars and then Edit. The Edit toolbar actually brings that information, and you can just pull it there. But that gives you the ability to select a whole thing, a whole group of things, and comment that out if you don't want that to run, because a comment is not run. It's just text that is readable. So everything here would be comments, and that would be ignored by Excel at runtime. So if I didn't want to bold the font, but I would want to keep the code there in the future so that I can put it back, perhaps I can comment it, and when I'm ready to activate that code again, I can uncomment it. Okay, so if I now I can now basically go and copy these parts of code underneath each step that's applicable to them, and basically make it a bit of a neater piece of code so that the user or the reader of this information can understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So I can basically bring this. So that's the auto filter, and then that would be column deletion, and this would also be column deletion. And I mean, if I run this code now, and I'm going to show you, I'm going to run this code now, then it will work. It will do exactly what we just did. But we want to make this dynamic, so we want to make this, we want to be able to actually run with this information at any point in time on any data set. And to make it scalable like that, we would want to we want to actually go into the code and make sure that it's doing what we want it to do, right? So this is the date formatting. Just cut this and put in there, and then this is the final step, which is, oh, we can just remove this. Okay, so this is already a lot neater, and I can see what I'm doing and when which step is being called as part of this, right? I can actually remove this information because this is not telling me anything, but the keyboard shortcut I would want to keep there for any user in the future, right? So bolding the header row, this is fine, but as part of good macro practice or good VBA practice, I would not want to do a selection. So I'm going to remove the select and the selection. So I'm just going to say row 1, make the font bold, right? I don't have to select the row, and that's the power of VBA. Again, with this, the auto filter, I can literally just go and say dot auto filter, and I'm going to show you now why I can say dot auto filter. Then with this, I can again remove the selection, and with this I can also remove the selection because I can delete columns without selecting them. And on this I'm not going to do cells, because cells is essentially running through all cells in Excel or in the sheet, and that's not always the best way. So I want to actually go determine the used range of the sheet, and I'm going to show you how I do that now. But yeah, any selections I remove, and via that is essentially already there. So then I am going to, I'm going to go through all of this piece by piece. So firstly, good practice would be to make sure that I can actually run this as a function, right? And what I mean by that is a function can be called by other functions and by other subs. So I could, if I call this as a function instead of a sub, I can actually pass parameters into it. A sub can also receive parameters, but I can't just call a sub directly as I would call a function. And we'll unpack this a bit more, but let's say, for instance, I wanted to reuse this function in the future. I could actually say, you know what, I want to pass the workbook and the sheet into this as a parameter. So which means I can actually tell this code to run on a different Excel workbook and on a different sheet. So that's just good practice. I can do that. When it comes to variable creation, a variable is something that can contain a value, and that I can use that value throughout the workbook, and you're going to see what I mean by that. But I can now go and define a variable, and I can, for instance, call WB as workbook. Okay, so I'm going to call my workbook or WB, and I'm going to dim my sheet as a worksheet. Okay, and you're going to see it's what they call IntelliSense pop up, so I don't have to type out the whole word, and that enables me to actually code faster, right? So then I'm just going to say if the workbook is nothing, then set workbook as this workbook, and we are going to cover this in a lot more detail as we go through the VBA modules, but this is just sort of a first taster and a flavor of what you can actually do. So okay, for instance, now just to give you information. So what I'm telling Excel is, I'm telling Excel or VBA, I tell it that I want a variable called workbook that I want to be able to refer to, and I want a variable called sheet or sh. And if workbook is nothing, then set workbook as my workbook that I'm working on, this actual workbook, right? I can actually say active workbook here as well, which means I can run this code, and if I'm active on a different workbook, then it'll actually run on that workbook and not in this workbook, if that makes sense. Same with sheet, but on this I'm just going to say active sheet. So wherever the code is called in this workbook, the active sheet will actually run this code. Okay, and why I'm doing that is because I want to be able to run this on a sort of range of information. And if I look at this, the next steps would be I want to determine the used range of my information, because I don't want to run across all hundreds of millions of cells in Excel. I want to run it on just on the data set, just the table that contains my data. So to do that, I want to determine what is my last row and my last column. So again, I'm going to create variables for this, and I'm going to say dim L row as long, and long is a version of integer or whole number, and long is essentially just a whole number or an integer value that can accept a very high number of values. So good practice is not using integer, because I could have said dim L row as integer. So I could have said dim L col, for instance, as integer. But integer would actually have its limit at 35,736 or something, which is the upper limit of an integer. So if anything goes above the 35,000 or 36,000 range, then my integer will actually cast a value, or it will throw an error, because it would not be able to contain a value that high. And that's why typically I just use long. It uses a little bit more memory, but in the modern day and age, it's negligible, the difference between a long and an integer. A long is just a whole number, so I want to say my last column is a long, which is a whole number, my last row as well, because rows can actually go above 1 million or just above 1 million, but an integer can go that high. So if I have a large data set, long would actually enable me to define that. And then I never remember how to determine my last row and my last column off by heart, and you'll see why, because it's quite complex. So I just Google it every time. So you can literally go and say Excel VBA and then say last row on sheet. Okay, and there I've got the first one, Excel Campus, which is by John Akampora, and then I go down and I go to the code, and I found my code there. That's the last non-blank cell in column A and the last non-blank cell in row 1. Perfect, that's exactly what I'm looking for. And you sort of gain what they call Google Fu, which is like Kung Fu, but using Google, right? And I always start my Google searches with Excel VBA, because then Google knows where to point me, and then I ask a question, and I typically get my answer. So yeah, that helps me get the last non-blank cell in column A and the last non-blank cell in row 1. So it gives me last column, last row. It's exactly what I'm looking for. I can leave the comments in there, because it's good programming practice to just comment your programming. So I've done that now. Okay. Next up, I can actually go and set a range. Okay. So again, I'm going to dim, and I'm going to say full range. And I don't need to do all of this, but this is sort of good practice to just do this, because it just makes my code more readable, makes it more versatile, makes it more scalable and everything. So all of what I've done up to this point is not necessary, because my code is working, it's running, right? But this is going to help me as we move down, because I can refer back to these variables, and it's just going to make my life easier, and you'll see why. So dim full range as range. This is just an Excel type, and this is an Excel type, and this is an Excel type. So everything is baked into the VBA eco space, and it works beautifully with Excel because it's been working with Excel forever. Then I can say set full range, and again, just to use the IntelliSense, I just go FULL and then control space, and that fills in the rest for me because there's no other reserved word that contains full range like this, right? I'm just going to say set full range as, and then I'm going to use something called a function called range, and I'm going to use cells. So cells gives me the ability to give it a row index and a column index. So I can say start in cell row 1, column 1, which is A1 essentially, and end in cells L row, control space, fills in the L row for me, LC, control space, gives me all of the sort of stuff, but there's my variable. So last row, last column, close the cells, close the range, and I think that's it. Okay, so I basically told, sorry, this should have been closed there as well, and then it's just a double close there. So this is telling it that my full range of information that I'm working with is cells 1 to cells, well, cell A1 to cell in the last column, last row. And good practice is also to start this as SH, because then what's happening is I'm just referring to SH as the active sheet. So I'm just saying use this sheet, my active sheets range, so that if I by mistake, when I start running this code, go to a different sheet, Excel doesn't get confused as to where it's supposed to run. So if I make sure that we're working in this workbook and in the active sheet, then I have nothing to worry about. So again, good practice would actually be to say workbook.sheet. So workbook sheet range, then I know even if I navigate to other sheets, it's going to run on this. It's going to run on the actual one that I've purposely selected. And then just to bed it all down, I use the with block, and the with block I can now say with my full range, do the following. And good programming practice is just to tab my information so that it sort of shows me what is contained within what. What do I mean by that? I'm going to tab this across, and I'm just going to, let's just tab it like that. And all this does is it basically shows me that everything below with full range is contained within the block of this with full range. And then I just close off this with full range at the end with an end with. So this is a block of code that contains the information that I want to run. And what that now means is I don't need to go and refer to just rows 1, 1, and I don't need to now go say this workbook dot active sheet dot rows 1. I don't have to go and do that. I can just go dot, because what that means is with full range is going to actually, what it does is it actually puts full range in front of this, and it's basically saying in my actual full range that of information that I want to run in, go to row 1, and I don't have to go and put that next to each line now, because the with just gives me the ability to go dot, and that's how it works. And that's why the dot autofilter will work, and I don't need to go and say selection dot autofilter. I know that it's going to take my full range and apply an autofilter to that. Hope that makes sense. Again, same with columns. I could just go dot columns. There I can just go dot columns. There I can go. There I need to say cells now, because I don't have to replace everything across all the cells. I just do it on my full range. So I just remove the sort of cells from there. Again, on this one I can just go dot, and the same on this one. Okay, So now I know that all of this code will only run on my full range. And my full range is in this workbook in the active sheet, only this range of information. Okay, so that's good programming practice. This works, no changes necessary there, that we don't need to change. And we're going to test this code now. Then for this, we're going to do a little bit of a tweak in order to determine, we want to run through the columns and determine which one of them don't have headers. Again, the same with this, finding empty columns. The replacement of the null data, that's perfectly fine, no changes necessary there. On the dates, we want to determine which of them actually have dates. And then the last thing is just sort of another piece of good practice is going at the end and going full range dot entire column dot auto fit. And what this does is it just sort of, after everything is done, just goes and auto fits the column. So it just makes the column the width that it's supposed to be to contain the data, and that just makes it everything neater, so that it's not displayed in this sort of fashion where stuff is cut off over there. Okay, hope that makes sense. Right, so next steps would be we want to determine just make sure. So next steps would be that we want to determine which columns don't have headers. Okay, in order to do that, we're going to do what we call a loop. Okay, and I'm going to use a for loop, and I'm going to explain this in a lot of detail in the future. I'm not going to explain it in too much detail now, but essentially what a for loop does is it just loops through information, and I tell it exactly how many times to loop and how it's supposed to loop and what it's supposed to do while it's looping. Okay, so what do I mean by this? I want to go through every column now in my full range, and I want to determine which ones don't have headers. So I'm just going to create a new variable here. I'm going to say dim, and what's nice about this is when I create a variable over here, it's only contained within this block of information, right? So it's not carried across through various functions, etc. It ceases to exist after the block. Okay, hope that makes sense. But I'm going to say dim cell, and I'm not going to use cell as a double L because cell is already a defined name within Excel, and I don't want to overwrite that. So I can even call it CL if I wanted to, but I'm just going to call it cell. I'm going to say dim cell, and why I'm calling it cell is because I want my code to be as readable as possible. So a reader, someone after me, would need to come and understand what am I referring to here, and it makes sense that I'm using the word cell because I can actually read it as pseudo language. Okay, hope that makes sense. But I'm going to say dim cell as range because it's an Excel range. One cell is a range within Excel, and I'm going to say for each cell in, and then what I'm going to say is I'm going to determine now I want to actually just go through row 1, but I don't want to go through the whole row 1 because, well, I can actually go through full ranges row 1 because that is only going to limit it to the last column, right? So that's perfectly fine. So I can actually just go dot row 1 like that. For each cell in row 1, what do I want to do? I want to determine if that cell is empty. So I'm going to say if cell equals blank, then delete for me. You can see I'm indenting it so that I know what is contained within the if, what is contained within the for, and what is contained within the width. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm going to say instead of columns A, I would want to say column. The column is the same column as the cell that I'm testing now. So I'm going to just say go cell.column. And we're going to unpack what we call locals later on, and you'll see how this actually runs and how it gets defined and everything. It's beautiful. and then I'm just going to close my if with an end if, and you can actually type that as one word and just go enter, and it will automatically put the space in there for you, because it's also a bit of IntelliSense. And then I can just go next, or I can go next cell. Next cell is just good practice, because if I have multiple for loops within each other, then I can show the reader exactly which for loop am I nexting, if that makes sense. Right, so that's what I'm essentially doing on this one, and this should work. And then the next one is remove any empty columns. And how do I determine what is an empty column? I can determine that by actually going and testing, sort of counting the values. Let me show you. So for this, I'm going to create another variable. I'm going to just call it A. And typically we use A or I in programming. You can use A, B, C, I, J, K. Typically we use that for loops. And it's just because that variable gets assigned a number, and I use that number as a reference throughout the coding, and having just one character to refer to is easier than referring to a whole word. But I could call this asblock if I wanted to, but A just makes it easier. So I'm just going to say dim A as long again. You can use integer, but long just gives you a higher number of possibilities, because you never know how many columns or rows you're going to get. So it's just good practice to use long. Okay, so I'm just going to say dim A as long, and then again I use a for loop, but instead of now going and saying for each cell in row 1, I'm going to say for A 1 to last column. Okay, so what that essentially does is it's going to run, and it's going to start at 1, and every time the for loop runs, it's going to increment my value of A from 1 until the number of the last column, and the last column will be 19, so it's going to run 19 times. It's going to run 1 first, then 2, then 3, then 4, up until last column. Okay, and this makes it versatile, it makes it scalable, because if I have 5 columns, it'll run 5 times. If I have 19 columns, it'll run 19 times. If I have 500, it'll run 500 times. And that's the versatility, right? And that's why it's important that I've defined these variables up here, because I only define it once, but I can use it multiple times throughout my code. Alright, I've used it there, and now I've used it there again. And I can use it as many times as I want to. So what we want to do is we want to now determine whether that actual row or that column is empty. And how do I do that? I can use something called a worksheet function. And what worksheet function is, it actually enables me, it brings Excel functions into VBA. So I'm going to say worksheet function. I'm going to say work, and then control space, down, tab, and then that gives me that. And then I can say, okay, so there's all my worksheet functions that I can use. You'll see there's a hell of a lot of them, okay? But essentially my worksheet function that I want to use is just count A. Okay, again I typed count and then down tab to select it. And now I can use my normal count A function as I would be able to use it in Excel. And what do I want to count? I want to count a range of information. And the range that I want to count is essentially, I'm going to use the range function again, and I'm going to say between cells, and I want to actually start in row 2 because I want to skip my header row. I want to start in row 2, and I'm going to go row 2 for which column? Column A. Okay, and that's why I used this one now, because we're running from column 1 to the last column. Every time this runs, it's going to pass my actual current column into that variable. So I'm going to say in the first case, it's going to be row 2 of the first column, which is column A, and then the next time it runs in the second column, and in the third column, and in the fourth column. All right, and it's going to go up until cell's last row, but still the same column. So I want this worksheet function to count for me everything that is within the current column, which is column 1, from the second cell up until the last row. Count that for me, and then tell me, just make sure I've closed all my brackets, if worksheet function count A. Okay, if that is 0, then I know that my whole column is empty. Then what do? Delete that column. Let's just see what's wrong. Cells A. Okay, I need another close bracket there. Okay, because I need to close the count, the range, and the cells. Right. Cool. So then I want to delete that column, end if, and I want to just go, after you've done all of that, just go to the next A, go to the next column, and in this case I can just refer to column A. You see, that's why I used A. So I could have called this my col or column or current column, but then this would have just made my coding much longer, because I've referred to it multiple times. All right, and that's how I would do that part. And then the replace, that's fine, we don't have to touch that. Last step would be to determine where something is a date, and then do the text to columns on that. So how do I do that? Same story. I can literally use the same sort of logic. So I could just, I don't have to dim A again, because A will actually go up until the last column, and then I can reuse it. So I can now just go and say for a 1 to L col, and I can then go and or I could have used cell again as well. Could have said for each cell within a specific range. Let's maybe rather do that. It's actually better practice. So again, I don't need to redefine cell, and if I do, Excel is going to tell me that there's a duplicate declaration of a variable. So I can just use the variable again. I'm going to go for each cell in my range. And what range do I want to check? I'm going to say range of cells between row 2, because I don't want to look at the header row. I want to just look at the first row and say, is that a date? And I know that there's a potential issue there, because it could be that there's a column of dates and there's one that's empty, or the first row is empty but the rest of them actually have dates in it. I know that's a risk, and if that's a risk, there are ways to get around that. That means I would want to run through, let's say, the first 10 or the first 50 or the first 100 values and check if all of them are dates, or if at least one of them are dates. But for the purposes of this exercise, I'm just going to look at the second row, and I want to say I want to start at the first column, and I want to run up until where the same row, because I just want to check row 2, but I want to run up to the last column. Okay, so for each cell in that row of information, which is the second row, up from the first column up until the end of last column, I want to just say if that cell, and then there's a function called isDate. So I can say if that cell is a date, and what's magic about that is it actually can take a string value. So even if it's not defined as a date currently in Excel, it's going to check, is it a date if I take this string and I try and convert this as a date. So it doesn't really matter in which format it is, it's going to try and convert it as a date regardless of format and say it's probably a date. Okay, and and this returns what they call a Boolean value. And in programming, Boolean is essentially just true or false, or 1 and 0, but it's typically true and false. So, and to see that, I think you can actually use the IntelliSense, and I can do this. You'll see there, I can give it an expression, and it returns it as a Boolean. So I'm going to say if cell is a date, then do this essentially. So take the actual column that I'm in, and I'm just going to, let me just select the whole thing, and then tab it, and then select that second part, just tab it. And you'll see that when something is really long, we tend to actually split it across multiple lines. So this is one line of code essentially. So I can split it down multiple lines by just going space underscore and then going to the next line. So I can break up anything. If this is too long for me, for instance, I could have just gone space underscore enter tab, and it'll accept that as well. Okay. So this piece of code, I just need to now go and say, well, instead of column L, I can just say my current cells column, and instead of destination range, the first cell of that column, I could go and say instead of range, I could just go and say cells, refer to one cell. My row index is the first row, and my column index is the cells column. Okay. And I just need to close this bracket. Okay. Then that should fix it, and then I just need to make sure that I close off my end, or my if. I need to end the if, and finally I need to go next cell. So this is going to run through each cell, and it's going to say if that cell is a date, just each cell in that row. If that cell is a date, then make the whole column dates, or try and format the whole column as dates. And then this last one is fine. Remember to make the header row lowercase. Okay, so what we can now do is we can now go and say, there's multiple ways of doing this, but again I'm just going to quickly use a loop, and again I can just use the cell, so I can just go essentially just copy this across, and then say for each cell in range cells, so we can actually go and say cells, this is the first row and the first row up until the last column. And then what I want to do is I want to say cell equals L case of cell. So L case is just lowercase, and I'm just going to go next cell, and that's going to hopefully work. So if I've done this correctly, it should actually do exactly what we set out to do. And I'm just going to put this to the side again. I'm going to open up our Excel window, and instead of running it on raw export, which is already fixed, I'm going to create another copy of this. I'm just going to put it there, and I'm going to call that raw export 2. And let's see if this actually does what we told it to do, right? Let's just do this, and I'm just going to close this sort of project window. I'm going to bring this one up so that we can view the variables as they go. If you want to see this local window with me, then you can go into view, and you can go click on locals window, and it should open it up there. Immediate window actually gives me the ability to print information. So let's do that, right? So let's go print. So I can go debug.print, and this is just for debugging. While I'm creating my code and while I'm testing my code, I can actually tell Excel to give me back information. So I'm just going to say print the last row, and I can actually say, if I don't just want to see the number, I can say, okay, tell me last row space close the brackets, ampersand to join them up. So tell me it's the last row, and then also print for me the last column. And I can go column, and that would be L col. Okay, so that's the immediate window. And while I'm going through this whole code, all of this code, I can actually put multiple of these debugs in there, and it'll show me the information in the immediate window. And then there's also this little tab at the side where I can click, and if I click this is putting a stop. So if I run this code, it'll actually run but stop over here. And then the stop gives me the ability to run it again, or just check what it's done up to this point, and then run it further, or from that point onwards step through every single step. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to step through every single step without a stop, but I'm just to run this. You can see if I go into the run window, I've got F5 to run, and it'll actually run through full speed, and it should do this in like 2 seconds, maybe 5, maybe 1 second. Should do all of what we've just written, but then you also have break and reset. But if I go into debug, then F8 allows me to step into the code, and that's what we're going to do now. But I can also compile the VBA project, and what this does is it actually gives me the ability to make Excel sort of pseudo compile the piece of code and tell me about errors or issues in my code. So it's told me that it doesn't like this this piece of code because for some reason it didn't like my piece of code. So I'm going to just go oh, it's because it's a rows. Okay, then I can go debug again and compile, and there it's compiled now without error. Okay, so my code is fine. Now I can run through it. Okay, I'm going to press F8, and you can see immediately the expressions are appearing. It's telling me that it's running through module 1. It's got the following variables defined: workbook, sheet, lrow, lcol, and because lrow and lcol are longs, there's my type. They are defined, or they are initiated or initialized as zeros, and because my ranges are ranges and my workbooks and worksheets are workbooks and worksheets, they are nothing currently because they're not defined, they're not initialized. Excel doesn't know what to initialize them as. But as I go through this, you'll see it actually skips over the dims because the dims are actually done before. And it's basically testing, is workbook nothing, and we know that workbook is nothing, and I can actually hover on it and it'll say workbook is nothing. So I wonder how workbook must feel. But if I run through this, it's going to actually go and say set the workbook as this workbook. So now you'll see workbook is now defined as this workbook. Magic. And then next up, sheet. Set sheet as active sheet. There. It's set the sheet as sheet 22. So if I want to check it, I can see that sheet 22 is raw export 2. It is my active sheet. It's doing a great job. Okay. I can also expand this at runtime, and you'll see it contains a hell of a lot of information about worksheet 22. I think it's sort of hanging now. No. So there you can see it. It's got lots of information. It's got a hell of a lot of information about sheet. It's got the name of the sheet, for instance. So I could go sh.name and it will actually return, or it'll actually contain the value raw export 2. It's got lots of information, right? It's got height and width and all kinds of things. So I'm not going to use that information now, but it's available at runtime so that I can inspect it and actually elaborate or build out on my code in that way. lrow, let's see, it's found the last row is 3289. Let's scroll down and check if that is the case. Yes, 3289 is the last row. Perfect. Okay, and then I go and debug.print, and it tells me my immediate window last row is 3289. Okay, beautiful. it's doing exactly column 19. I know there's 19 columns. Again, last column 19. Okay, perfectly executed, and you can see that on the, because I mean every time I run this code, because I'm experienced in this, I'm not stepping through my code every time I run it. I just run it, and that's why the debug is nice, because my debug tells me afterwards what was the value of that variable at that point in time where I called the debug, and that's the reason for it. Full range, I can now define my full range. Object doesn't support this property or method. Let me just see what I did. Let's just try debug and remove this little WB and see if that works. Invalid or unqualified reference value, not dot sheet. Okay, that works. So that it didn't like me referring to the workbook and the sheet, because the sheet is already the sheet within the workbook. That makes sense. So I just want the sheet, and then with full range, make the first row bold. Let's see if that happens. So, okay, first row bold, filter applied. Okay, now I want to say remove any columns without headers. For each cells in row 1, okay, runs into this, and it says the cell. Okay, so it's defined the cell now. If the cell is blank, so let's see the cell's value. What is the cell's value? Value 2 is blank. There's no value 1, but there's a value 2. It's blank. Okay, so it is blank. Let's see. Type mismatch. It might not like this rows 1. Okay, let's just let's try and change this range and say range cells. We're going to look at the first row, first column, up and until the last, no sorry, the first row, last column. You just want to look at the first row in its entirety. And I want to close this bracket. Alright, let's see if that works. I'm just going to pull this little arrow back up and say now I want to run through each of these cells. Okay, worked. So it's determined that this cell is blank, and it's going to delete this column, hopefully. There we go, delete it. Okay, and it's going to go through every single other column that we have out there. And so if I want to run to the next one, I can just go and put a little break there and just click on the play button, and it will run through all 18 other columns or 17 other columns and check, but none of the other columns don't have headers, and then run through to my next piece of code, and then I can just click outside there to just remove that block or that break from the next time. Okay, now we're going to run through from the one to last column. So you'll see it runs 19 times, and it's going to count each time. So it's counting, and it's not 0 because A is not 0. So we know that J is, we check that J is zeros, right? So by the time we get to 10, and let's just run through this code, you'll see A is incrementing as we run this through. But it's checking every time and it's counting. Now when it's 10, J, and it's counting, it's actually checking, and it's finding 0 from the second row all the way down to the last row. And it knows now I can delete column J. And there goes column J. Okay, beautiful. And it's going to run through all the other rows. Again, I can put a block there or a break there and click on the play button just to skip through it, but we might as well just tab through because it's only 19. Okay, then replace all nulls with blanks. Boom, that's done. And then the next one is for each cell in my range, find where there's a date. So it's going to run through this one, not a date, that 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 one, not a date. By the time it gets to F, which is which is 6, so it's hopefully this one, it's going to say, yes, it is a date. There we go. And it's going to say, well, do all of this now. Okay. So check column F. Boom. Okay. If I pull this open, we'll see it. It's actually converted it into a proper date. And this is now a date according to Excel. And to check that, we can actually go and just change the formatting if we wanted to and make this a general. You'll see that it's a date. Right, so that's my date, and I can just go through all of this and it's going to change all of them, skip through the other ones, and then there goes L, there goes M, etc. Okay, so I'm just going to put a block there, click on play, skip through the rest because it's working. It's made all of my dates. And then the next one is replacing all spaces. You can check there with underscores. Boom, that's done. And then for each cell in the range, it's making everything lowercase. So let's see if that works. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, working like a charm. Then lastly, it's doing an auto fit. So I'm just going to go like that. And then auto fit just goes and expands all my rows. Yeah, beautiful. We're done. Hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed that. Yeah, that's just a little bit of the power of VBA and Excel. Yeah, leave me a comment or a question if you have any. Thanks.